I've decided I will only be making a single Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson joke in this entire segment. With many of the games in the franchise getting all of their representation, it was now time to grab something from the Galaxy games. I guess they didn't have to technically choose a single power-up from both Galaxy games, but they did set a precedent by choosing only 2 power-ups from all of the new Super Mario Bros. Games. Galaxy 1 actually had a decent amount of power-ups to choose from. The issue is many of them felt like a derivative even if they were pretty cool in and of themselves. Or some of them just feel like they wouldn't fit. For example, the bee mushroom would have been really cool to use, but having a bee mushroom cup just doesn't feel right. Likewise with the boo mushroom. I would not have minded the spring mushroom, I feel like that could have worked, but it seems like they decided to go with the rock mushroom from Mario Galaxy 2 instead. Which works for me. I feel like the rock mushroom was pretty iconic, although I think I would have preferred the cloud flower, but it's entirely possible they felt a cloud cup would be a little bit too vague. But honestly, my biggest surprise here is that they didn't pick the spring, and that's specifically because Mario Galaxy 2 was never on the Switch, whereas the first game was. So I feel like they would prefer to grab something from there. But that's fine, it's not a big deal. Also, since we're on the topic, directly after the series is done, Mario Galaxy will be starting. I don't think there will be any day breaks between the end of Kart and the start of Galaxy, but I will take this chance to remind you guys that if you join my Patreon, you will not have to wait for the scheduled upload. As soon as the first Galaxy video is done, it will be available on there. And I can make an announcement on my channel when that happens. Also, speaking of 3D Mario, I think it was a little harsh that Mario 64 and Mario Sunshine specifically were shafted. I understand they had no power-ups, but I feel like there are enough assets in those games where something else could have been chosen. Mario Sunshine would have been an obvious. You could have had the Shine Sprite Cup, and you could have easily gotten rid of the Fruit Cup for it. Mario 64, well, you can't really do the Wing Cap or the Invisibility Cap or any of that stuff. The Star Cup already exists, and that feels like it would be the only thing you can choose. Honestly, for Mario 64, I'm at a little bit of a loss of ideas. Even the Shell Cup is already there. If you guys think of something, let me know. I got nothing. Anyway, I'm not surprised this is so difficult because there are no power-ups in either Mario 64 or Sunshine. Replacing the Fruit Cup with the Shine Sprite Cup would have been enough for me, but I also really don't like the fact that they have a Fruit Cup, but I'll get more into that when I cover the Fruit Cup. This is the 17th cup in the game out of 24. These are the scores for the first 16 cups. This is the scorecard to determine how I'm grading everything. The link to the playlist and to my Patreon are in the description if you want to watch the past videos or the future videos. Otherwise, let's get started. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's Rock Cup has a first track of London Loop from Mario Kart Tour, Boo Lake from the Game Boy Advance, Rock Mountain from the Nintendo 3DS, and Maple Treeway from the Nintendo Wii. Similar to New York, London is one of my favorite cities in the world. I've gone there a handful of times and I've enjoyed it pretty much every time I've gone. This one was released on Mario Kart Tour a little bit later than New York, so it does have a little bit more polish than New York does. But I also think it's a little bit more confusing than New York's is to get around. And that's because in London they drive on the other side of the road. In all seriousness, this is one of those tracks where I find myself making the wrong turn every so often. But if there's one thing I have to praise is that I think they get a lot of the best highlights of London on this track. And I like that not only do the laps vary quite a bit, but they're also pretty good about keeping them different yet equally enticing. In some of the other tracks, it felt like only a single one was the star standout of the race. But in this case, it feels like all 3 laps are pretty well balanced. That being said, while I do like this track a lot, I don't really go out of my way to play it. I feel like the simpler city tracks are done better in the simpler ones, and the more complex city tracks are done better in the more complex ones, if any of that makes sense. Basically, if we're strictly talking about the ones I covered prior, this one feels the most like Paris and Tokyo, and those were 1-pointers for me. Even if this one is a little bit better than those two, it doesn't quite reach the heights of Sydney, which I would consider a 3-point course. And it doesn't have the cool night vibes that New York had, which I think rounded it up to a 3. So while I do think this is a fun one to play when you do land on it, I wouldn't go out of my way to play it, and this is definitely one of the tour courses that do feel samey. So we're going to have to settle on 1 point. Next up is Boo Lake from the Game Boy Advance. If I'm not mistaken, this is only the second haunted theme in this entire game. The first one was a Twisted Mansion way back in the Flower Cup. I haven't played Nintendo 64's Banshee Boardwalk in a long time, and I know it was brought over to DS and I liked it on there too. But I feel like this Game Boy Advance remake of Boo Lake kind of takes a little bit of everything. Wraps it all up on a Game Boy Advance track and then throws it into Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. This is a very simple track, much like many from the Game Boy Advance. It can get pretty competitive, but it's also a lot on the simpler end. I think this track would have done much better if it didn't have any walls. The random anti-gravity sections and the underwater make me like it more than something like Snowman Land, for example. But I think if the turns were just a little bit more complex, I would have enjoyed this one a lot more. So while I absolutely love the theming, it doesn't do enough to earn that 3 points, and I'll have to settle on 1. Up next is the 3DS's Rock Mountain. Oh, that's why they chose the Rock Mushroom. Or maybe this track was chosen because of the Rock Mushroom. It's another Yoshi or Egg situation. I think for all intents and purposes, this track should have been the final one of the Grand Prix, but they knew that Maple Treeway would be the epic finale for anybody, so they didn't dare put this one after it. I'm not sure about anybody else, but this is always the track that I associate most with the Nintendo 3DS, Mario Kart. Like when I think back to playing Mario Kart on the 3DS, it's always on this track. I don't know why, I think this one might have been on the marketing material, I can't remember, but it's always the first one that sticks out to me. So the coolest thing about this track was the glider. The glider obviously was introduced in Mario Kart 7, and this track was a chance for players to mess around with that. The problem is in Mario Kart 8 that is no longer interesting, and despite them trying to add some things around the track to make it a little bit more enticing, I don't think they were able to succeed at that, and this track remains extremely simple and a bit bare bones. It's not a track that I necessarily hate or will go out of my way to avoid, but it is so boring that I would consider it a low 1-pointer. I'll be honest, up until covering this one, I didn't even know what its name was. I said what its name was. Oh, come on. Okay, its name is...
It doesn't matter what your name is!
Maple Treeway is awesome. This one's similar enough to Waluigi Pinball where I feel like I don't even need to explain why it's awesome. Whether it's the layout, the stage obstacles, the turns, the aesthetics, the nostalgia. Oh, the nostalgia. There were quite a few tracks that when their return was announced, I was extremely hyped for, but this one sat easily on the top of the list, or at least pretty close to it. It's weirdly a very difficult track for a very simple route. Part of that might be because you're going downhill, so it just feels a bit more exhilarating, but I don't know, I always felt like this one was a lot more difficult than it should be. Which isn't bad by any means, I actually think that makes it a lot more enjoyable. But at the end of the day, I know that I love this on a Nintendo Wii, and I know that I love it now on the Nintendo Switch. It is a 3-pointer, and it is in the ranking for one of the best courses in the game. And I think it might even be in the ranking for one of the most popular courses in the entire franchise. Because the fanbase absolutely loves this one. Which, of course they do, it came from the Wii. But it not only came from the Wii, it was really good. But what's unfortunate for the Rock Cup is that it's largely being carried by Maple Treeway. There are no other tracks in this Grand Prix that would really stick out. London, Boo Lake, and Rock Mountain are just kind of there. On the plus side, however, I would say everything is pretty diverse. Daytime in London, nighttime in Boo Lake, Rock Mountain just looks like an area of the Mushroom Kingdom, and Maple Treeway looks like a dream I never want to wake up from. An easy 3 points. The hard one that I gotta think about is the difficulty curve. I don't think Maple Treeway is the hardest course in the game, but it's definitely the hardest one in this Grand Prix. So that one is in the right spot. I think if London Loop was placed elsewhere, it might have still worked as being the easiest track in a Grand Prix, but when you have Boo Lake and Rock Mountain, I'm not sure I can make that claim. I'm not even sure if I can make the claim that Boo Lake is easier than Rock Mountain. So I know this one is wrong for sure, I just don't know which order would be best. Maybe it would be Rock Mountain, and then Boo Lake, and then London? I feel like if it was like that, I would have gotten the point. Which is a bit reassuring for me because now I don't feel like it's because of the tour track being first that costed the point. Because track 3 is better than track 2 anyway. So let's make this one official. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's Rock Cup gets a single point for London Loop because I liked it, a single point for Boo Lake because I liked it, a single point for Rock Mountain because I liked it, and 3 points for Maple Treeway because I loved it. And an additional 3 points for everything being uniquely diverse, 0 points for the difficulty curve, which lands them at 9 points. Man, this cup is very lucky it got Maple Treeway. It's funny, a lot of times prior to really scrutinizing these things, I like to look at the 4 tracks on the surface before I even get into it. I can kind of get a feel for something that I'm really going to like or something that I'm going to find boring. And even on the rare occasion find something that I actively avoid. When I looked at this one, the first 3 didn't really stick out to me, but Maple Treeway definitely did. And then when I started really getting into it, I confirmed what I thought. Every now and then, I'll think that it's going to be phenomenal, and then when I actually start looking through the track, I'm like, this is kind of boring. But this was definitely not one of those times. Speaking of which, there are a few tracks that many of you think should be zeros, and sometimes even when I'm going through them, I'm debating between a 0 and a 1. Being this deep into the retrospective, however, I realize that zeros are a lot harder for me to justify. I've been saying all along, as long as I don't actively avoid playing the course, that means it's good enough for me. So I've kind of realized that the main reason that I avoid playing specific courses is usually because there's one that's similar but better. With so many rainbow roads in the game, it's no wonder that the one that I like the least ended up getting a 0. With Baby Park feeling like an inferior version of Excitebike, I never feel the need to go to that one. But then you have something like Moo Moo Meadows, which is a little bit different. It's better than a few of the tracks that I've given 1 point to. I can admit that. But I don't actively avoid certain tracks like Toad Circuit or Snowman Land for the Game Boy Advance, or even potentially Boo Lake and Rock Mountain, which I would say are on par, maybe. And I think it's because something like Moo Moo Meadows is nestled safely into my memory. Whether it's because of the fan base or because of my own experiences. Basically, Moo Moo Meadows ends up getting a 0 because I know it too well. Otherwise it would be a 1. Which I realize sounds absurd, but at the end of the day, I actively go out of my way to avoid playing that track. And that's really the only criteria I have. I felt like going into that because I'm starting to realize what I do consider a 0 and what I don't. And it just seems like there's very little that I consider a 0. So I thought it was worth the discussion. But on that note, I think it's time to move on to the Moon Cup.